Ukraine became independent from the Soviet Union in 1991. But in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea to its own territory and denies its involvement in the ongoing occupation of two of Ukraine's eastern provinces by Russian-speaking separatists. Today, the Lifelong Learning Institute brings to you the former United States Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, to talk about the prospects for peace in the region. Let's join the class session.
Well, welcome today to the Montgomery College Lifelong Learning Institute. We are having the fourth session out of 4 of our class, Ukraine and the Crossfire of Conflict between East and West. As you know, earlier sessions, we had guest speakers from the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, Mr. Peter Wojciechowski. We also had a speaker who wrote an article, a very interesting article for Foreign Policy Journal, Mr. Frank Brown from the Center for International Private Enterprise. And then last session, we had Ms. Natasha Sachs, who's the head of the Lifelong Learning Institute, the program manager, who is a native of Ukraine and told us a bit about life in Kiev. Today, it is my honor and privilege as the instructor of the Lifelong Learning Institute class on Ukraine. Melissa Stone is my name, to introduce to you our guest speaker, Ambassador William Taylor. And I should tell you that I'm just so delighted that Ambassador Taylor could join us. He comes with quite a history with him. He is a graduate of West Point as well as a graduate of Harvard. He's worked in our legislature with Senator Bill Bradley. He is currently the executive vice president of the U.S. Institute of Peace. And more interestingly for our class is he is the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine who served between the years of 2006 and 2009. And so we are so lucky to have him with us today to talk with us about what is happening in Ukraine now. What is going on there? We look forward to your perspective, sir.
Thank you, Melissa. It's a pleasure. It's a privilege for me to be here. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to talk with you, and I'm glad that I am the fourth speaker. So you all are now experts in Ukraine. You're probably know as much about Ukraine as most people in this region. So it's great for me to have an opportunity to talk to people who have done some work on it. And as experts, I look forward to the second part of this conversation, which I hope will be a conversation. That is, I'm glad to answer Melissa's question about what's going on now in Ukraine. There's a lot going on, and so we'll have something to talk about and talk a little bit about how we got to where we are now. Probably some of your earlier speakers went over some of this too, but this will be just kind of a review. But the second part in this conversation will be conversation. So I do look forward to your questions. I hope I say something in the first part of the conversation that is provocative or that is interesting or that you disagree with, because when you're talking about foreign policy, when you're talking about Ukraine, we're talking about Russia, there are a lot of views. There are a lot of views about the pros and cons of what the Russians are doing and whether the Ukrainians are doing the right thing as well. So that part of the conversation I look forward to. In fact, I look forward to that more than the first part when I do the talking. So let me try to answer Melissa's question about what's going on in Ukraine today, right now. And as you know, reading the papers, I told Danielle that I would not stand in front of the map here. So, and I'm going to be instructed to move if I make a mistake and stand in front of the map. But what's going on in Ukraine right now, you can read in the newspapers. First of all, part of Ukraine, that is Crimea, right here, has been annexed illegally by the Russians. And I'll do this quickly and we'll come back to pieces of this as well. The second part of this story is that the Russians and separatist Ukrainians in two parts of Ukraine, that is Donetsk and Luhansk, so this part which we call Donbass, the Russians are supporting separatists there. They're supporting them with weapons. They're supporting them with army troops. They're supporting them with funds. They're supporting them with leadership. So the Russians are effectively, let's be clear about this, I'm going to try to be frank with you today, the Russians are stirring up trouble for their own reasons, and we can speculate about why that would be, but in that part of Ukraine. And they have annexed Crimea, so they have actually taken part of Ukraine away from Ukraine. The infrastructure, I'm probably am I messing up your camera? Sorry about that. The infrastructure in Donbass, that is the bridges and the roads and the buildings and the airports, are destroyed. And someone is going to have to repair them. And one of the questions that the Russians and the Ukrainians are going to have to face is where does that support come from? How does this infrastructure get repaired? The rest of Ukraine, that is other than Crimea and other than Donbass, is going through its own set of difficulties economically. Because they've been fighting a war, and because they have other economic problems, a lot of the economic assets for the rest of Ukraine are focused here. I mean, in Donbass, this is where a lot of the heavy industry was. So the economics overall of Ukraine are not good, and Ukraine's been in a depression. That is, growth is contracting, growth is going down, as it is in Russia. Russia is having the same kind of economic problems. We'll come back to that as well. Another problem, what's going on now, as Melissa asked, is that Ukraine is still facing some of the problems inherited from when it was part of the Soviet Union. It is not, after 24 years, it has not cleaned up the corruption that is inherent in a lot of the Ukrainian society, and a lot of the Ukrainian economic structure, as well as the government. So that corruption is a big problem for Ukraine. It's a big problem in the region. When I'm talking to Ukrainians about corruption, by the way, I make the point that all countries have a problem with corruption. And I tell them that the United States has a problem. You can't pick up a newspaper in any city or any state or in the nation's capital in this country without reading about some representative or governor or senator who is either accused of or on trial for or in jail for some kind of. So we have the problem too, but the Ukrainians have it in spades. They have a big problem with corruption, as do the Russians. The other thing about Ukraine today is that for the first time, the people, the civil society, the non-governmental organizations, the independent media are much more alive, much more empowered, much more active than they have ever been in the past. And that's a good thing. We will talk about how that how the people power, if you will, had a real effect on Ukraine. It's one of the things, frankly, that Mr. Putin is concerned about. He worries about the people power that he sees in Ukraine, and he sees in other countries as well, even the Arab Spring and other places where people rose up against dictators, and Mr. Putin is worried about that. And so if Ukraine succeeds in response to people power, then Russians will ask Mr. Putin, why can't we do that? So Mr. Putin is concerned about that aspect of Ukrainian success or not. Now, so those are some of the challenges that Ukraine faces right now. However, they've got some things going for them. On the one hand, Ukraine has been invited and has now signed the first part of a European Union association agreement. That means this is kind of a step in the direction of integrating Ukraine with Europe. And Ukraine's neighbors to the west are part of the European Union. So it would make sense for Ukraine to join the European Union. This will not happen soon, But since Ukraine is a European country, in particular if you think of Europe going from the Atlantic all the way to the Urals mountains here, if that's kind of traditional definition of Europe, then Ukraine's smack in the middle. So Ukraine is smack in the middle of Europe, and it's been invited and it's taken the first step toward joining the European Union on the European Association Agreement, European Union Association. When we'll talk about that too, because there was a role there in this current crisis. The second thing that's associated with joining the European Union is trade. And so the Ukrainians and the Europeans have signed the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, the DCFTA, Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement, which the Russians asked to be delayed to implement, but the delay ends in 2 months, in January. So in this coming January, Ukraine will join the rest of Europe in free trade. And this will be good for Ukraine. This will be good for Europe. So this will be good for both sides. Mr. Putin, again, may be a little worried about that. As he sees Ukraine moving toward and into Europe, he is concerned, but that's something that the Ukrainians have going for them as well. The next thing that the Ukrainians have going for them now is that they are united. The Ukrainians are united for the first time since they have had their independence. So they got their independence in 1991, 1992, when the Soviet Union disappeared. But since then, Ukraine has kind of been divided. And Melissa, you may want to show the map. Yes, perfect map, well done. It's been, since 1991, 1992, when it became independent, Ukraine has been divided somewhat oversimplistically into East and West. And the western part of Ukraine, and here's the Dnieper River, so that's kind of a dividing, but not entirely. But kind of to the western part of Ukraine are predominantly Ukrainian speakers. And again, I'm sure many of your earlier speakers have talked about the role of the Ukrainian language. So kind of the western part of the country, and this red is mostly Ukrainian speaking, okay? And then there's this pink that is predominantly Ukrainian speaking. And then there's the yellow and the striped here. And the yellow is mostly Russian speaking and significant ethnic Russian population. So you see where kind of the language is. Now, for a long time, since independence, there has been this general orientation of the Russian speakers toward Russia, and the general orientation of the Ukrainian speakers towards Europe. And that is played out in the politics. And so the politics, let's just look at presidential elections in Ukraine. In most of the elections that have taken place since Ukraine was got its independence in 1992, there has been generally two leading candidates. There have been other candidates, but then they have a runoff, and the top two run off against each other. And there's usually a candidate from the western part of the country, and there's another candidate from the eastern part of the country. And they've been pretty evenly divided. That is, one election that elected President Kuchma, who was from Dnipropetrovsk. So he's kind of from this part of Ukraine. And then the next election in 2004 was the election. A candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, was from this part of the country. So the president switched, and it's gone back and forth between the two sides. But it's been pretty evenly divided until today. So in 2014, I'm going to get to some of this history. So you've already heard some of it, but I'll just review it for us in a minute. But in 2014, there was an election, and for the first time since independence, every oblast, and so I don't know if you want to show all the oblasts again, but you just get a sense of all these oblasts. Every oblast, every county, if you will, or state, better the way to think. Every state in Ukraine, all of those from the east, from the west, in the south, not including Crimea for reasons that I will describe, voted for the same person. They voted for the current president, Petro Poroshenko. So up until 2014, Ukraine was evenly divided, and they alternated presidents, one from the east, the next time from the west, and back to the east. This time, 2014, the whole country voted for Petro Poroshenko, and he got either a majority, in most cases he got a majority in all these oblasts, or if not, a strong plurality. So he was elected with support from all across the country. First time. That's an asset. That is a strength for today's Ukraine. They are now united. And what united them? That in 2014, the presidential election took place after the Russians invaded first Crimea and then Donbass, and that united the Ukrainians against the Russians. So for the first time, Ukraine is united. Thank you, Mr. Putin, for doing what Ukrainian politicians haven't been able to do in 24 years. There's also growing support in Ukraine for joining the European Union. I already talked about how they signed an association agreement, but it's been gradually increasing support among Ukrainians for joining the EU. There's also growing support for joining NATO. Now, this is pretty controversial. When I was there, Melissa mentioned that I was in Ukraine from 2006 to 2009, and there were many debates about NATO. There were many debates about whether or not Ukraine should be neutral, whether or not they should be associated with the Russians, whether or not some people, in particular in the western part, were very strongly supportive of NATO. But when I was there, it was the support for Ukraine joining NATO was probably 20%. It's probably 20% at best. Today, it's over 50%. Which is a big deal for Ukraine as a whole. It's obviously over 50% because they now see that their big neighbor to the east and to the north that they thought was a fraternal ally. They thought the Russians were supportive of them, and they've got a shock. The Ukrainians were shocked when the Russians invaded Crimea and annexed it. Annexed part of their country, part of Ukraine. They were further shocked when the Russians sent their military into Donbass. And that's had an effect on the Ukrainians saying, maybe we need support. Maybe we need security support from the Europeans and maybe from the Americans. So this is a gradual increase, but now, as I say, it is over 50%. It depends on the poll, but we're talking about 55%. We're talking. Another thing that Ukraine has going for it is support from the international community. Now, this is both economic support, financial support, and political support. So on the economic side, on the financial side, I mentioned the Ukrainian economy is in bad shape. Fortunately, they have the support of the international community, in particular, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. The IMF has offered a loan on very good terms, very long. Anyone in this room would love to have a loan like the Ukrainians have. Long term to pay back, low interest, no payments for a while, for $17 billion. Now, probably we don't need $17 billion, but the Ukrainians do. The Ukrainians need about $50 billion. And so the IMF has stepped up with about a $17 billion program, loan program, that goes some way toward help, toward that $50 billion that the Ukrainians need. The international community, Americans, the Europeans, the World Bank, other international development banks, they have also chipped in. So the United States, for example, has offered very concessionary loans to the Ukrainians for $3 billion. So you got 17 from the IMF, you got $3 billion from the Americans, you probably got another $3 billion from the Europeans, and you got some from the World Bank. and other international bonds. So you're getting up there, but you're still short. The Ukrainians are still short of what they need in order to pay their bills. So one of the ways that the international community is supporting, and it's not just governments, and it's not just the International Monetary Fund, but it's also the private sector, is that the private creditors, those people who bought Ukrainian bonds, who invested in Ukraine, and bought bonds in order to support Ukraine, were expecting those bonds, those loans, to be paid back. And they were demanding payment. And so part of this $50 billion that the Ukrainians need is debt payments to private creditors. So the new Minister of Finance in Kyiv, her name is Natalie Jaresko. And Natalie Jaresko, when I was there, was totally American. You know, she was born, I think, in Chicago, grew up in Chicago, speaking Ukrainian. I mean, she's Ukrainian-American. So when I was there, she was a banker in Kyiv. She was a banker the whole time. She's been a banker for a long time in Kyiv, a successful investment banker. And Petro Poroshenko, the man I mentioned, who for the first time unified Ukraine in the recent presidential election, asked Natalie Jaresko to be the finance minister. Now, the problem was she wasn't a Ukrainian citizen. But as the president of Ukraine, he could fix that, and did. And he offered her Ukrainian citizenship. She accepted. So she's now a Ukrainian citizen. She is a member of the Ukrainian government. And she virtually single-handedly negotiated with this range of creditors from all over the world who had bought bonds in Ukraine. And she got them to agree to write down the interest rate and to write down the principal and extend the payments. So this is a major accomplishment that Natalie Jaresko was responsible for, and it's going a long way. When you add, that's worth about $17 billion as well. That reduction in debt payments. So you can see we're getting up. The Ukrainians are getting close to where they can pay their bills. They're by no means out of the economic woods. They've got big trouble still going on, but they've got support. Politically, the Ukrainians have support. So when the Russians invaded Crimea and annexed Crimea, the international community, to its credit, said this is a major violation of every treaty, of every norm, of every standard, of every expectation that the international community had of international relations. The Russians, when they invaded Crimea, broke treaties, a range of treaties, multilateral treaties, as well as treaties with the Ukrainians, where they said the Russians would respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. They would respect the sovereignty of Ukraine, and blatantly broke those treaties. So the international community did what it's supposed to do. It went to the UN, and the UN Security Council considered a resolution to censure the Russians for doing this. Well, we know who sits on the Security Council, and we know that certain members of the Security Council have veto power, including Americans, yes, but also including the Russians. But the vote was interesting. The vote did not pass because the Russians, of course, vetoed it, but the vote was interesting. It was 11-1 with a couple of abstentions. So the Russians had no support. But the interesting thing about that was they only got one vote, their own vote. Normally they could count on the Chinese. The Chinese abstained. Even the Chinese abstained. So the Russians were totally isolated in the Security Council. The international community then went to the UN General Assembly, UNGA, and had a similar vote. And the Russians lost there as well, 100-10. And you can imagine who the 10 were. So we got North Vietnam. You don't have North Vietnam. You have North Korea, sorry. You have North Korea. You have Venezuela. You probably had Cuba. You had the kind of the usual suspects that will support Russia. And then 100 countries voted against Russia and voted to censure them for invading Crimea. So the international community has made its views clear on this as well, in support of Ukraine. I mentioned earlier, as part of the problem that Ukraine faces, that is this civil society, this civilian community of journalists, of non-governmental organizations who are now empowered but frustrated that reform is not going faster. But that's also a strength. That's also a strength because they are pushing, the people of Ukraine are pushing for reform in Ukraine. So that's kind of, that's partial answer to Melissa's question about what's going on now. That's what I would describe to you as what's going on now. Now, briefly, how did we get here? And for this, let me just go back. Why don't I stop there just for a minute and just see if there are any questions on anything I've said so far, because that'll give me an opportunity to shut up a little bit. And if you all have questions on it, yes, please, sir.
I appreciate your comments on many, many aspects of things. On the NATO issue,
Yeah.
50% are in favor, 50% are opposed, I suppose.
Actually, it's probably more like 50 or 55% in favor, maybe 30% opposed, and the rest not sure.
Given the actions of Putin in Russia,
Yep.
how anxious are the NATO nations to accept Ukraine?
A good question, a very good question. So in order to join NATO, a country has to apply, and any European country, Ukraine certainly is European, can apply. In fact, I think any other country can apply too, but the EU has the requirement that any European country can apply, so they can do. But NATO, any country can apply. But your question is exactly right, and that is the NATO members, the current NATO members, the 28 members now, have to agree unanimously. Now, in 2008, while I was in Kyiv, we tried, even though there was only about 20% support in Ukraine for joining NATO, we suggested, actually, I wouldn't even put it that way, the Ukrainian government under President Yushchenko, whom I mentioned earlier, said, I am going to try to take Ukraine into NATO. Even though I, President Yushchenko, know that I've only got about 20-25% support, I'm still going to try it because I, as president, am worried about the Russians. It didn't work. And it didn't work because the Germans and the French were concerned that if Ukraine were to join NATO and if the Russians were to invade or threaten or cause trouble in Ukraine, that NATO would be required to support Ukraine militarily. And the Germans and the French were not ready to do that at the time. So that's still a problem. I mean, that's still an issue. Your question is exactly right. So if 100% of the Ukrainians wanted to join NATO, still if there were one European country or one NATO member country who didn't want it, they couldn't at the time. This is changing now. So the Ukrainians hope that over time the Germans and the French and other NATO members will become more supportive. And indeed they have. But that's an excellent question on that thing. Other questions so far here? Then let me just review the bidding. And again, previous speakers have probably gone through some of this, but I'm not going to go all the way back to Tsarist times, but I'm only going to go back to 2004. And I'm going to repeat a couple of things I said, but just to put it in kind of historical context. So in 2004, there was a presidential election. The incumbent president, President Kuchma, from the eastern part of the country, decided he's not running again, and indeed a good decision. But that opened up the presidency to two people who neither was an incumbent. So two people coming to run for president, neither one was the sitting president. So it was an open seat, if you will. Like I said, every time there's been a presidential election, up until the most recent one, 2014, there have been, in the end, a candidate from the East and a candidate from the West. And so in 2004, the candidate from the West was Viktor Yushchenko. Now, you may remember that Viktor Yushchenko was the candidate who was poisoned by somebody. It's never entirely clear who, but it was very clear that he was poisoned. Face pocked. He was a very handsome, very attractive man before he was poisoned. And some people say he never fully recovered from that attack. But he ran. He ran, and the poisoning took place during the campaign. But he ran in 2004 for president. His opponent from the eastern part of the country was another Victor, both of them first name were Victor, Viktor Yanukovych. So Viktor Yanukovych was supported by the outgoing president, President Kuchma. Both of them came from the east. Yushchenko came from the west. And again, it came down to very close. But in 2004, in those elections, the man from the east, Yanukovych, was named the victor. No, not the victor, because they were both named Victor. Was named the winner of those elections. And so he was about, and President Putin congratulated him, said, "Great job, Victor." The people said no. The people said this election was so fraudulent, was so rigged, was so stolen that we're not going to stand for it. And this was the first Maidan. The Maidan refers to a big square in Kyiv, a big public square, big public open square. It's a beautiful part of the city, and Kyiv's a beautiful city itself. But they came into the square in their thousands, in their tens of thousands, in their hundreds, in their millions. There were people, and not just in Kyiv, but all over the country. People protested the corrupt nature, the stolen nature of that election in 2004. And they wouldn't go home. They stayed in the square. And the election was in the fall. The people stayed in the square through the winter, through the snow, through the ice. They stayed out there. People brought food and brought blankets and wood to burn and education for the kids. It was pretty amazing. This was the beginning. This is called the Orange Revolution. This was the beginning of that growth, flowering of civil society that I mentioned earlier. It's called the Orange Revolution because Viktor Yushchenko had this big orange scarf. And that became the color for this revolution. So it was the first of the so-called color revolutions across the Eastern Europe at this time. So the people stayed in the square. And finally, the Supreme Court struck a deal. And they said, okay, you're right. It was a bad election. It was a fraudulent election. We'll do it again. And so they did it again. And this time, Viktor Yushchenko, he of the orange scarf, won. And there was great celebration. So that was the Orange Revolution. It was a successful revolution. And so Viktor Yushchenko, a guy from the West, took over from the guy from the East. Problem. His running mate, if you will, was, you may also remember seeing pictures of two people on the stage in the Orange Revolution, both having orange on. One, a pockmarked president, but the other, an attractive woman, blonde hair with a braid on top. This is a very traditional hairstyle in Ukrainian, not folklore, but Ukrainian tradition. You can help me with this. But Yulia Tymoshenko was her name. And Yulia Tymoshenko was by far the best politician in Ukraine, by far. I mean, those two men who ran for president, they weren't near the quality of politician. I'm not saying that she had the best policies of anybody in Ukraine, because she was populist, and so a little bit irresponsible economically. But she was very popular, and she organized a good party. And Viktor Yushchenko, the winner, named her as his prime minister. Now, about this time, I show up. So I got, this was 2004, 2005, and I got there in 2006. And when I was there, 2006, 2009, there were 5 prime ministers because Viktor Yushchenko couldn't agree with, couldn't work with, couldn't govern with any of those prime ministers. So he kept going through prime ministers. She was prime minister twice. Viktor Yanukovych, the guy who ran against Viktor Yushchenko in the presidential election, was a prime minister, was named prime minister for a while as well, and others. All of which to say is this was not a successful governing system. That is, President Yushchenko, who had won the Orange Revolution after battling out the corrupt election, couldn't govern. He let personal rivalries, jealousies, insecurities get in the way. So that period of time, when I was there, was not a time when Ukraine could undertake the reform that they needed to do. I mentioned the corruption that lasted even from Soviet times. They had an opportunity to fix that, they didn't. So the next election, so that was 2005 election, 2010, 5 years later, 2010, there was another election. This time, a person from the east, Viktor Yanukovych, who tried and failed before, and a person from the west, Yulia Tymoshenko. So she ran for president in 2010, but as I mentioned, she had been prime minister. And so she bore the burden, took the blame for the terrible economics. And you will recall that in 2008, 2009, the world, you remember here, the world was in a terrible recession, the Great Recession. Well, it didn't spare Ukraine. And so all politicians anywhere, in most parts of the world, bore the burden and paid the price politically for being in office at that time. And she lost. And Viktor Yanukovych, who had lost in 2004, won in 2010. Ukraine was going towards Europe at the time. Ukraine, even in the East, the business people, the big businessmen, people call them oligarchs, even in the East, they recognized that economically it made no sense to tie their cart to the Russians. If you had a choice of a Russian market or a European market, is not a hard decision. So Ukraine in general, broadly, was moving towards Europe. Now, Viktor Yanukovych, the new president, recognized that, and to his credit at the time, he was about to sign this association agreement with the Europeans. And he was actually en route to Brussels to sign this agreement that was a first step toward association and maybe eventually membership, when Mr. Putin woke up. Mr. Putin said, "Whoa, you're going to do what? You're going to sign an association agreement with the European Union? No, you're not." And so Putin says to Yanukovych, "I tell you what, the Russians will provide you, Viktor Yanukovych, with $15 billion. This will be a loan, cheap loan. It'll help you. You can use this. And I, Mr. Putin, will provide you, Mr. Yanukovych, with cheap gas prices, very inexpensive gas prices. Natural gas produced in Russia goes through Ukraine on to Europe, but Ukraine also uses a lot of that Russian gas. And so if the Ukrainians can pay less for that gas, then they get a benefit." So that was good enough for Viktor Yanukovych. And Viktor Yanukovych, who was flying towards Brussels, did a U-turn, flew back to Kiev, and told the Ukrainian people, "We're not signing with the Europeans." The Ukrainians had a different view. The Ukrainians were very eager to join Europe. And when their president accepted this big bribe, we'll call it what it was, from the Russians to not join Europe, they did what they had done 5 years earlier, and they went to the streets. They went to the street, actually 8 years earlier. And like the Orange Revolution, when the people went to the streets and stayed there all winter, well, they did it again. And they flooded the streets in 2013, and they stayed there through the winter, the end of 2013, beginning of 2014. They didn't leave. Mr. Putin told Mr. Yanukovych, clear those people out, get them out of the Maidan, clear them out, use force if you have to. When Yanukovych tried to do that, he killed about 100 Ukrainians. This further enraged the Ukrainians, and they more came to the streets, and finally Yanukovych fled. He gave up. He just unilaterally left in the face of this overwhelming demonstration of people power again, just like they had done in the Orange Revolution. This was the second Maidan, so this is called the Revolution of Dignity, they call it. In the face of that, he just left. He said, okay, I'm out of here. And he goes to Russia. That's where he is now. So Ukraine's left without a president. And so the Constitution says, with that case, then the head of the parliament, the head of the Rada, takes over as president. So he did, Mr. Turchinov. And then they had elections, and then they had a presidential election. But before they could do that, when Yanukovych fled Kyiv, he was in Kyiv, and he fled to Russia, Mr. Putin again woke up to something happening in Ukraine that he didn't like. And that night, that very time when Yanukovych fled, Yanukovych was Putin's ally. Putin saw that his ally had given up, had left, had vacated the presidency. What did Mr. Putin do? Invade Crimea. That was the time. That's when he sent in his special forces. First, he said there were no Russian troops in Crimea. A clear, blatant lie that even he admitted. A couple of weeks later, he said, oh, well, actually, there are. In fact, he started giving medals to some of the soldiers, the Russian soldiers who had helped invade Crimea. So that was his response. His response was, okay, I got to do something. My allies fled. I'm going to do something. I'm going to annex Crimea. So he did. He had a sham referendum in Crimea. Anybody who campaigned for continued association, Crimean association with Ukraine, was either beaten up or disappeared. And the Russian soldiers were all over Crimea for that referendum. So anybody who was not in favor of being annexed by Russia some people were killed and some people were just disappeared. So no surprise, that referendum won by 97%. Sounds like North Korea. That's the way elections go in some of these places. And that's certainly the way it went here. Not long after that, he goes into Donbass. The U.S. response had been to put sanctions. After he invaded Crimea, the U.S. put sanctions on. And these were financial sanctions on people who had ordered that invasion, and travel restrictions, so that they couldn't, the people who had ordered that invasion and parliamentarians in Moscow who had supported it were sanctioned, they couldn't travel. And their assets were frozen in London, where they had their kids in school, or in Miami, where they owned a lot of property, or in New York, or in London, where they parked a lot of their money. So those sanctions on individuals were in place after Mr. Putin invaded Crimea. But then that same summer, so this is now a year and a half ago now, we were trying to get the Europeans to join us in harsher sanctions. And Europeans were reluctant, and to be fair to the Europeans, when you put on sanctions, it hurts both sides. Economic sanctions get in the way of trade and commerce are usually, almost always, good for both sides. So when you stop some of that trade and commerce, both sides feel the pain. Turns out, of course, that when you sanction the Russians, they get hurt more than the Europeans or the Americans, and that's why we would do it, wouldn't do it otherwise. But there's no doubt that there are some Europeans who would otherwise sell to the Russians that under sanctions can't. So we, the United States government, we were in discussions with the Europeans about stronger sanctions on the Russians in response to their invasion and their stirring up the trouble and the separatists in Donbass. And we had a lot of conversations, but one thing turned the tide, changed the European minds. And that was, a year ago last summer, a Malaysian airliner flying over Donbass, coming from here, going that way, flying over Donbass, and the Russian separatists with Russian-supplied anti-aircraft weapons shot down that civilian airliner, MH17, killed 298 civilians. Now, the Russians, of course, say two things. One is it was an accident, but two is they didn't do it. It must have been the Ukrainians who did it, or it must have been the Americans who did it. Sometimes we get blamed for doing this. But it's crystal clear to the international community, with the exception of the Russians, who's responsible for shooting down that airliner and killing all of those people that landed, and the plane crashed into Donbass. That was the trigger that got the Europeans to agree to harsher sanctions, which they did. And the Americans and the Europeans put on harsher sanctions. And we sanctioned the defense industry in Russia, we sanctioned the finance industry in Russia, and we sanctioned the energy industry in Russia. And that means that those sectors, those businesses in those three areas can't refinance their investments. They can't go to banks, they can't go to the international bond market and borrow money any longer. This is a major effect. It's not the biggest effect, it's not the worst sanction that we can put on, but it's a tough sanction. And that has had an effect. That has had an effect on Russia. That's almost where we are now. I want to just do a little bit, that's a little bit more, because the story now switches to Syria. The reason it switches to Syria is that these sanctions that I just mentioned had a real effect on the Russians. However, we were lucky, I will say this. We were lucky on these sanctions, because sanctions by themselves would have had an effect, but not the effect that they actually did have when reinforced by another economic trend that happened at the same time, and that is the dramatic fall in oil prices. So when oil prices fall, countries who export oil, read Russia, are cut off from or find their revenues dramatically reduced. So the combination of tough sanctions from the Europeans and the Americans and the Australians and the Canadians and the Japanese, and all joined in these sanctions, the combination of this international sanctions with the falling oil prices has had an amazing effect on the Russian economy. Now, I mentioned the difficult time that the Ukrainians are having, but the Ukrainians have support from the international community. They have the IMF that I mentioned. They have the creditors that gave them a reduction in their debt. They have the World Bank. They have the Americans. They have the Europeans that are helping them out. The Russians don't. So the Russians have both the sanctions and the falling oil prices and no international support. So that combination of political isolation, of economic sanctions, led the Russians to start looking for alternatives. It happened about the same time that they were looking for alternatives, some way to get out from under these sanctions, or some way to change the name of the game. Turns out that about that same time, their only ally in the Middle East, Bashar al-Assad, President Assad in Syria, was starting to lose to rebels, to opposition forces, some of whom the Americans were starting to support. And so these rebels, these opposition forces, the Syrian opposition in Syria, were actually about this time that we're talking about, this is less than 6 months ago now, starting to make some progress against Bashar al-Assad. And the amount of territory that Assad controlled was shrinking, continues to shrink. And so the Russians, Mr. Putin in particular, has only one ally down there in that part of the world, and it's Bashar al-Assad. So this happened about the same time as he was feeling the real squeeze of the economic problems caused by sanctions and oil prices. And so one of the reasons that he moved to send troops and airplanes and other forces into Syria was to try to be seen by the Europeans in particular as being part of the solution, part of the responsible international community by moving into Syria and trying to help resolve that problem by supporting Assad, and so maybe getting back in the better graces of the international community. Well, didn't work. It turns out, of course, that by supporting Assad, Mr. Putin extended the Syrian war, made it worse. And the migrant crisis, the immigration crisis, the illegal migration crisis that is coming out, and the migrants that are coming out of Syria in response to the Syrian civil war increased. The flows increased once the Russians started bombing. So this is not what the Europeans were hoping for. And Mr. Putin is not having the effect that he had hoped to help be part of the solution in the Syria crisis. So, but we're here to talk about Ukraine, but I did want to give you that final chapter on the Syria business. Again, let me stop there and see. I'm hoping that I have provoked some good. Yes, sir. And here's the.
The sanctions are due to expire in a few months. The prime ministers of Slovakia and Hungary have been saying what a splendid chap Putin is. Angela Merkel's got a couple of million refugees on her hands. What's going to happen?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. The sanctions have been extended once. The Americans, of course, wanted them extended. Most of the Europeans wanted them extended. The Europeans who wanted them extended were led by Angela Merkel. She has been as tough as anyone on the Russians. You may recall, your point about Angela Merkel having a big problem is exactly right, but you may recall that before this crisis, Angela Merkel from East Germany speaks Russian, and remember Mr. Putin was stationed when he was in the KGB. He was stationed in Dresden, so his German's flawless. They had an understanding. Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin understood each other. And indeed, she, before this crisis, before the Ukraine crisis, was probably the leading European trying to avoid a big clash between the Europeans and the Russians. That ended when the Russians invaded Crimea and Donbass. And it ended when Putin lied to her. And she did not accept, she was not pleased being lied to, and was disappointed that relationship that she thought she had with this leader of Russia turned out to be worthless. So she has been tough on sanctions, and she got them extended the first time. You're exactly right. There are Europeans in this part of Europe, not the Poles, but probably the Slovakians and maybe the Hungarians, maybe the Romanians, maybe the Bulgarians down here, could be vulnerable to pressure from Mr. Putin. He tried it before, failed. And people were worried that the sanctions wouldn't be extended until next year when they were extended last summer. They were worried that some of these guys would be a little weak, and it has to be unanimous. It has to be, in order to extend these sanctions, it has to be unanimous in the EU. So they were worried about it. But Angela Merkel, tough as she is, pushed it through. So I can't answer your question about what's going to happen in 3 or 4 months when they come up again. I can point to what happened before. My expectation is they'll be extended, if for no other reason, that the Russians have resisted any attempt to investigate that shoot down of the Malaysian airline jet. When the Security Council tried to mandate an international investigation, that the Dutch, there are a lot of Dutch people on that flight, and the Australians and a couple of Germans, when they took it to the Security Council, asked the Security Council for an investigation of who shot down that civilian airliner, the Russians vetoed it again. So my bet is that the Europeans will have a hard time lifting sanctions until and unless that is resolved, that is, figure out who's responsible for shooting that airline. But also, they've been negotiating in Minsk, in Belarus. Capital of Belarus is Minsk, where they've had these negotiations, and the Minsk agreement has been in force, although only recently the ceasefire has taken effect. But the Minsk agreement says that the Russians have to take all their troops out. So my bet is, my hope is, I will say, but I would also bet that the Europeans will stick to those sanctions as long as there's no investigation of the shoot down and as long as the Russian troops stay in Donbass. But you may be right. We'll see. Yes, sir.
I believe one of the other guest speakers mentioned that we were helping Ukraine improve the gas infrastructure in Ukraine. Will that be in effect for this winter?
It will be in effect. So a couple things on the energy side. The other way that the Russians, in answer to your question, the other way the Russians exert influence on both Ukraine but also on the Europeans is by supplying so much natural gas. The Ukrainians, and maybe this is what your previous speaker talked about, Ukrainians have made it a high priority to reduce their dependence on Russian natural gas. The Europeans have also taken steps to reduce their vulnerability to cutoffs. And one of the ways that they do that is, well, a couple of ways. One is they buy more gas from other parts of the world. They could buy gas from the United States. We're now exporting gas. We have the capability to export gas and oil if we would just be allowed to export it, but that's another issue. But the other thing that the Moldovans, Romanians, Hungarians, Slovakians, Bulgarians can do is they can add interconnections so that when and if the Russians were to try to exert their influence on Ukraine or on Europe to lift sanctions or for whatever reason, that there is the ability, that the East Europeans, Central Europeans will have the ability to get gas from other places. When earlier, 5 years ago, when there was a cutoff, actually when I was there, so in 2006 and in 2009, the Russians cut off the gas to Ukraine, which had the effect of hurting the Europeans, East Europeans. And at that time, the East Europeans didn't have other pipelines, didn't have interconnections. So they couldn't get gas from the Germans or from the Dutch or from the Brits because they depended on this gas going through. Now they do. Now they've got a lot of interconnections here. So the short answer is yes, they are taking many steps to reduce vulnerability and reduce dependence on gas from the Russians. Other questions here that I can help with? Sir.
You mentioned before the affinity that Merkel had with Putin because of the German and the Russian languages. We saw the map before of the language situation. Is language a code for something else? How important is language really in terms of the politics and the economics of the situation there?
This is a very interesting question, and it's a complicated question. You could probably help here. So let me try it. If you want to add, please do. So it's, the other map, good idea. It's not correct to say that Russian-speaking Ukrainians are not full-blooded, patriotic Ukrainians. It is not the case. Now, Putin would have you think otherwise. But it is not the case that people in Ukraine, even in the eastern part of Ukraine, where they speak Russian, and a lot of places here, up in here and all the way up to Kyiv, there's Russian spoken. There's Russian spoken. On the streets of Kyiv, I would say it's half and half. Or it's now 60% Ukrainian. Ukrainian is increasing. And this red bit is increasing. The Ukrainian language is growing, but even in the parts of Ukraine where they speak Russian, they are full-blooded Ukrainians and they are patriotic Ukrainians in most cases. Now, there are parts of Donbass that are separatists. And there are these little parts that are supported by the Russians, and they will say, you know, we don't have anything to do with Kyiv. But by and large, the bulk of the Russian-speaking, and again, you got these mostly Russian-speaking, the yellow, and the significant ethnic Russians in the stripe, they're full-blooded Ukrainian, and as I mentioned in the last election in 2014, they all voted for Petro Poroshenko from the West. So, by which I'm trying to say that it's not so simple as saying if you speak Russian, you must be in favor of Putin or the Russian Eurasian economic zone or something like that. That's not the case. Some people would have us believe that, but that's not. I mentioned that Putin would like us to believe that. He has said that Russian speakers anywhere can count on the Russian army to come defend them if they need defending. And now, there are a whole lot of Russian speakers in Ukraine who say, Mr. Putin, don't bother. We don't need your support. There are people in other parts of Eastern Europe that speak Russian that don't want to be defended by Mr. Putin either. So the language is complicated. I mean, there are a lot of different combinations here. But it is not, it doesn't say what the politics are. Did I answer that question? You want to follow up on that? Because I'm sure there are other questions on that.
My follow-up is tangential to this.
Please, please. And you can help. If you want to add to this, that would be good.
I guess we have come to realize there is an election in this country.
There is. I've heard that.
And there's a lot of things that are being said in terms of building up military and standing up to by various candidates on both sides.
Yes. Don't get me into the politics now. That's not what I'm here to talk about U.S. politics.
That was my question.
I was afraid of that. I was afraid that's where you were going. But fire away. I can deflect it here.
If
we'll see.
if in the Baltic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, who are members of NATO,
Yep.
We were in Estonia several times, and you hear the Russian on the street.
Yep.
And there's a nervousness that's going on there now. With a change in administrations or a change in the presidency, and there will be a change in the presidency from either party,
Yep.
how important would that be, in your opinion, concerning this part of the world?
So I can speak to that. I can speak to that without getting myself in trouble, because with a couple of exceptions, it's a big Republican field, right? And it's a smaller but diverse Democratic field. But nonetheless, I feel confident saying that whichever candidate is nominated and whichever candidate is elected next November, a year from now, he or she will support NATO, including Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, the Baltic countries. I am very sure that he or she will support them as members of NATO, and if they are threatened by the Russians, I am 100% sure that that president, whoever it is, will react very strongly in defense of NATO and defense of NATO members. And I will go further. I will say that whoever the president is elected a year from now will be a strong supporter of Ukraine against the Russians, because you take a look at what the candidates have said, not all of them, because there are a couple who would like to pull back, but the bulk of the politicians, bulk of the candidates, have said very clearly. I'll tell you an example of this in a sec. Very clearly about they've expressed their support for Ukraine. In Congress, there was, I think it was unanimous. I think there have been 2 bills that have passed in the past year in support of Ukraine, and I think they passed unanimously. One of them required the president, authorized the president to provide weapons to the Ukrainians. Bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate. Now the President Obama has so far not elected to do that. He has the authority to do that, and he has the funds to do that, but he hasn't decided to do that yet. But what I'm saying is, Support for Ukraine is not a partisan issue. It is not a partisan issue. It is Ukraine supported by, when I was there, when I was in Ukraine, Republicans and Democrats would come visit. President Bush came to visit while I was there. People on the Democratic side, Democratic senators would come visit. So just past Saturday afternoon, right here in Washington, in fact, it's right in front of Union Station. And I know people in Maryland may not know exactly all the geography of Washington, D.C. However, you probably know Union Station. And in front of Union Station is a big open space. And on Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock, thousands of mostly Ukrainian Americans, came to commemorate what they called the Holodomor. And the Holodomor is death by famine, death by starvation. In 1932 and 1933, Joseph Stalin, this is now all part of the Soviet Union, starved to death 5 million Ukrainians by confiscating crops, by putting army on borders and not letting people. So starvation is a terrible thing. And the stories about what happens when people starve are horrible. This has scarred Ukraine, 1932, 1933. We don't know much about that. Americans, the rest of the world doesn't know much about that. And it wasn't until 1991, 1992, when Ukraine got its independence, that people could even talk about it. Because in the Soviet Union, it was a crime to talk about death by starvation in 1932-33. So it was totally suppressed. It has been totally researched. And there was a monument unveiled on this past Saturday afternoon, right near Union Station, North Capitol in Massachusetts. So if you go by there, you'll see this bronze memorial. It's a field of wheat. It's very moving. It's very moving, the memorial itself. But there were thousands of people out there. And my point is that both Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton sent people there on their behalf and recorded statements that they read for this. So all of which to say, I'm not saying that either Bush or Clinton is going to be nominated or elected. What I'm saying is both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, in the political process, are supportive of Ukraine. Long answer to your question, but I think it's. But on this question about the language, you can probably elaborate better than I on this thing. You want to, yeah.
Well, I can say that when I lived in the Soviet Union, majority of people, probably 60% spoke Russian on the streets, and 40% spoke Ukrainian. But things are changing, and more people, even in what's considered Russified city as Kiev, identify themselves with Ukraine. So that's the country, that's the national language, and they use Ukrainian more and more. I also visited the western part of Ukraine, and there it's kind of a different extreme where people refuse to speak Russian, where you speak Russian to them and they respond to you in Ukrainian. And their ties to the Western Europe is so strong, they really would love any minute to join the European Union.
Yep. Yeah. No, I can tell just another story on that point. So well, two stories. One was when I was there in 2006, 2009. In 2007, my wife and I celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary. And we decided we were going to celebrate it in Crimea. And so here's Odessa. And there was a ship visit. A U.S. Navy ship visit came into Odessa, had a celebration. Oftentimes, almost always, when a ship comes in, the ambassador will go down and board the ship and give speeches and invite the local Ukrainians onto the ship, and it's a great opportunity for Ukrainians to see the Navy and for the Navy to show off and to send a signal as well that the U.S. Navy is supporting Ukraine. So I went on down there, and normally I would have security folks with me, but I said, give me, I want to celebrate my anniversary. I'd just soon do it without the security people. And they said, okay, it's probably a mistake, but they said. So I got in my car, and my wife and I drove through Kherson, this province. We don't have to go to the other, but trust me, this is Kherson. And then it connects into Crimea. And we went through the capital of Simferopol, and then down to the port here, and over to the coast. It was a beautiful part of the world. There were no Ukrainian signs, and obviously no English signs. They were all Russian, and I had some Ukrainian. So I got lost. I got lost in Crimea, but found my way and were able to do this. But in order to get there, I had to drive through Kherson. I mentioned that last year, in 2014, there was another presidential election where Petro Poroshenko won all of the oblasts, and I was an election observer here in Kherson. The capital of this province called Kherson is the town of Kherson, and I was right there. Well, I'd gone through that same town in 2007, and in 2007, Kherson and Donetsk and Luhansk and Kharkiv were all very Soviet, post-Soviet, but real kind of still Soviet cities. Pretty drab, pretty Russian-oriented, all Russian-speaking. But when I went back there a year and a half ago to observe the election, it was as if I was in Lviv. It was as if I was in Lviv, in the western part of the country, because they weren't speaking Ukrainian, but they had Ukrainian flags coming out of every balcony. They had yellow and blue streamers coming off the car antennas. The young girls had yellow and blue ribbons in their hair. The young boys had yellow and blue shoelaces. It was amazing. The traditional Vyshyvanka dress all over Kherson. And this is Kherson. This is southeastern Ukraine. This was such a difference from when I had been there in 2007, and this is 2014. So that's exactly the point, that Ukrainian is much more spoken now in this part, and people feel like they're Ukrainians. So I think this is an important milestone, important thing. Yes, Melissa.
If I might invoke instructor privilege,
Please.
I actually have a question for you.
Shoot, please do.
It just so happens that Ambassador Taylor and I were both on the U.S. delegation observing the election of President Poroshenko in 2014, and I happened to have been posted in Kherson, in this place just above Crimea.
Yep.
And the reason here, the reason why that's important is you can see that is where the bridge is between Crimea and where the election was actually taking place. So we anticipated, when we were in Kherson, we anticipated that there might be some voters coming from Crimea. But that didn't happen because apparently there was a significant border patrol that prevented any. So my biggest question, and I just can't seem to shake it, is what is Vladimir Putin? What is President Putin after? And I have a suspicion because, and I'll tell you what it is, and I'll tell you why, and then
you going to answer your question? Okay,
well,
this is good.
I don't know if I'm going to
Yeah.
answer it, but I'll tell you what I
Yeah.
suspect
Yeah.
and see if
Okay.
you might agree.
Okay, good.
And that is, when we were here in Kherson, we heard a report on the morning before the elections, and CNN didn't get it, BBC didn't get it. Nobody in the West heard the same report because it was in the Russian language, and it was on Channel 24, so it was broadcast to Russian speakers. And what they said in this news report was that the Russian-speaking peoples in these particular oblasts were going to boycott the elections, and that Putin wasn't only after Donetsk and Luhansk, but he was after 9 oblasts, all of them. See all of the yellow ones. that he was after all of them. And because of this, people on election day were horrified. Particularly, they were horrified because their sons were already being conscripted into the army. This was the first time since the Second World War that people's sons were being killed. They didn't want that to continue. The other thing that they were terrified about was the way that the Ukrainian election law is written is that unless a candidate receives more than the majority of the voters, not the majority of the voters, not just the majority compared to the other candidates, but unless they receive the majority of the votes cast in the entire election, that they do not win the election. There'll have to be a runoff. And so an overwhelming number of voters voted for Poroshenko. But as you remember, in that election, we had 21 candidates, including this Yulia Tymoshenko, who was so popular, although ousted for corruption reasons. But nevertheless, looking at this, I have another map that I know you know is my favorite one because I told him in advance. And that is, what could Vladimir Putin be after? Well, if you look at Russia, and you look at here, okay, Crimea is taken by the Russians. And you look over here, do you know what that is? Transnistria. It's right here on the edge of Ukraine. Used to be the Soviet Union, but Moldova split off, okay? And Ukraine split off, but there's a little group of Russians right in here. And then on top of it, looky here, when when Georgia started making rumble sounds for joining NATO and joining the EU, the Russians became upset about that. And what happened in Georgia, in Abkhazia, in Ossetia? That was during your tenure in 2009. We had Russian troops coming into these places. So it would actually make sense. Now, this is my suspicion, and I wonder if you agree, that if Russia took over this part of Ukraine, all the way over here, that, and I'll show you which oblasts they are, and they're the same oblasts that we were looking at before, previous. It's actually Luhansk, Donetsk, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, all the way over to Odessa. That's where Transnistria is. This would actually fulfill the Russian dream of having a warm water port on the north coast of the Black Sea. Do you think that's what he's after?
I don't know anyone who knows what goes on in Putin's mind. I think he might, I don't
Does
know.
he?
That's a
Was
good
the
question.
comment.
So I don't know, Melissa, if that's what he has in mind. I know that there are some people around him who have that view, who would like to have, and they call it Novorossiya, the new Russia. And this would all be part of Russia, but also this part would also be new Russia. So I know there's some people around him, but I don't know what's in his head. He surprised everyone when he invaded Crimea. I mean, no one expected anyone to violate all of these treaties that he had signed and that the Russians had signed since World War II, and certainly since the Cold War. So with that caveat, I would about who knows what's in his head. I would say that if he wanted to, he doesn't have the resources to do that. Militarily, he could do that. He could do exactly what Melissa said. He's got plenty of troops here. And his troops, I will admit, I will acknowledge, are very good now. Melissa mentioned the Georgia War. So he invaded Georgia in 2008, August 2008, 8/8/2008. And his army and his Air Force did badly. They performed very badly. The Georgians were so outnumbered. But the Russian military did not perform well in 2008. Since 2008, Mr. Putin has spent an incredible number of rubles, has used probably 4, 5, 6% of their GDP on the military, whereas we do 3 and most other countries do, 1. He has built up his military pretty substantially, and I will acknowledge that they're pretty good. And when he invaded Crimea, it was so much different from when he invaded Georgia. But that's an expense he can't afford any longer. And so if he had, and if his people around him have this idea that he could take this swath of Ukraine, it would be so expensive in all kinds of ways. It would be so expensive in financial terms, because the military operations like that are very expensive. It would be so expensive in cost of dead Russians, because as you said, the Ukrainians would resist mightily. And the Ukrainian army has gotten much better in the past year. It's not as good as the Russian army by any means, nor as big. But if the Russians were to try to take this, they would have a horrible time with the local Ukrainians. It would be partisan fights and ambushes, and the Russians would have a terrible time, would lose a lot of Russians. So in terms of the cost in terms of soldiers, dead soldiers, the cost in terms of international isolation and sanctions. I mentioned the current sanctions that are in place right now. There are much worse sanctions that we could put on. And if he were to do that, I can tell you that the sanctions are ready, that the U.S. government has sanctions ready to put on Russia if he were to take that move that Melissa describes. So I don't. Now, again, I'll go back to what I said. I don't know the guy. I'm not sure. I don't think he's crazy, but I do think he's impetuous. So he might try to do something like that. But the cost of him trying to do that would be very, very high, I would say. Yes, ma'am.
How far would Putin have to go before the West struck back?
So I think our striking back would probably, the West, the NATO, U.S. and NATO, would not be militarily. I think it would not be a military strike back. I think the escalation that we would do would be the sanctions on the Russians. If Ukraine were part of NATO, which they aren't now, but if they were, then I would be confident that the Ukrainians having gone through the accession process and made the commitments, and that we would defend them if they were part of NATO. But that's not the scenario we're talking about. The scenario you're talking about, if the Russians were to attack in the current situation where Ukraine's not part of NATO, then I don't think the Europeans or the Americans would send our military in. I could be wrong. It's just my own opinion. But I do think, I am certain, that the international price that he would pay for that kind of an invasion, or either one as you posit, would be very high, and he couldn't keep it. There was another question. Yes, ma'am.
Do you foresee a time when Crimea can revert back to Ukraine, and how would that be possible?
Great question. Great question. Danielle just asked me this question. I think the answer is yes, but it will take time. Melissa and I were both in Kherson. There's this oblast right here, observing the election. When I was there, you may have had the same kind of conversation, Melissa. I asked a lot of Ukrainians, Chersonians, this exact question. I said, you're living here, and a lot of them had friends, family still in Crimea, or people who had left Crimea to come into Kherson. Said, what do they say about that exact question? Will Crimea ever come back? And they say it will come back, but it will come back only when the rest of Ukraine is prosperous and European. When we Ukrainians, they said, are able to join Europe and raise our living standards to European levels, and raise our governance standards to European levels, and reduce our corruption down to European levels, when that happens, and when we can grow economically, and we can show the Crimeans that they're better off being Ukraine, then they'll come back. But no one said they were going to send the Ukrainian army in to take back the Ukraine. But did you have that conversation?
I had conversations with the whole with people not believing that Ukraine was powerful enough to
Yeah.
intervene without
Yeah.
assistance. But at the same time, I have to say that I'm very curious to know more about what you said related to what kinds of sanctions that we can impose, and if the U.S. would go it alone, or if we would team up with the European Union and other NATO allies. And the reason why I ask this is that after your tenure in Ukraine, I was posted right there in Azerbaijan from 2009 to 2013. And one of the things that became very obvious was that while the president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, is artful in his ability to negotiate between the Iranians and the Turks and the Russians, there seemed to be a continuing sort of desire amongst the Russian-speaking and Russian-allying population there to actually sort of be the sort of Russian Ottoman feud that has been going on for 1,000 years now continues in that region. And so you have the Armenians are on the side of the Russians, and the Azerbaijanis are on the side of the Turks. In fact, their language is very much like Turkish. They understand when someone speaks to them in Turkish. At the same time, if you look just south, who was giving Iran support not so long ago when the U.S. had sanctions in Iran, and how far is Iran from Syria if we're looking at what Putin is doing today? So it looks like there's an effort to redivide, in Putin's mind, to redivide what is Slavic and what is Ottoman or what is Turkish once again, but to redraw the boundary lines. Now, the question about the sanctions is actually not so ridiculous because Europe actually was a bit resistant to the sanctions that we were proposing earlier on because 70% of Germany's oil and gas was coming from Russia. And of course, the whole oil and gas, the whole energy pipeline issue became pretty convoluted after the Russians went into Georgia. In fact, the Azerbaijanis moved their pipelines. They had been going through Georgia, but then after the Russians started to take over and dominate that region, the Azerbaijanis built a new pipeline that goes essentially through Turkey. So how does that work out? How is that going to impact the kinds of sanctions if we have our European allies dependent upon the oil and gas coming from Russia and its allies? Then how strong are we going to be, or in coalition with our allies
Very
in
strong.
imposing
Very
sanctions?
strong. I would argue very
Great,
strong.
great, great.
I would argue very strong because
Okay.
because of a question that we talked about earlier in terms of the changes in the oil structure, and the Europeans becoming every year less dependent on oil and gas from the Russians and having alternative sources. So that's number one. But on your question, there's a very good question about sanctions. Do we have the ability to put on harsher sanctions, and will the Europeans join us? I think the answer is yes, because in the scenario that we're positing here, if there's a gross violation, if there's an invasion, an overt tank-dominated invasion, then the sanctions then the Europeans will act just like they did when the Russians shut down that airliner. It'll take something like that. But then I do believe that the Russians, that the Ukraine and the Europeans will join us in those sanctions. You asked about would we go it alone? We might. But I believe we would have the Europeans to support, because the one big sanction that we have a lot of control over, and that's the fund transfer system. It's called SWIFT. And the SWIFT system is the banking system that allows anyone in this room to transfer money anywhere in the world. And if the SWIFT mechanism is cut off for the Russians, then they are financially isolated. This is the big bomb. This is the big weapon and the Russians know it. The Russians know it, and they've indicated that they know it. So that is a big deterrent, which was what we're trying to do. We're trying to deter this invasion. We're trying to deter violence. And so I'm at the Institute of Peace, and so I'm in favor of nonviolent solutions here. And deterrence is a way to avoid violence, and so that's what we do, that's what we have to do on the thing. So I'm hopeful that that's the case. Other questions here?
Poland just elected a right-wing populist government
Poland did.
that
Right.
has a history of truculent relations with both Russia and Germany,
But good relations with us.
and particularly with the Russians. Is that going to affect, is the Polish attitude towards Germany going to screw anything up with Germany's look at the Ukraine?
It's a good question. It's a good question. Even the new government in Poland is supportive of Ukraine. The Poles and the Ukrainians have a lot in common. The language is similar. It's not the same, but it's a similar language. The economics are good. You can see why Poland would be interested in having Ukraine as a member of NATO, so that there is a buffer between them and Russia. So the Poles have been traditionally very supportive of NATO membership and European membership. And so I think this new government, this new Polish government, which is going to be more domestically focused than internationally focused, or at least than the European, EU focus. I'm not a Polish expert, but that's my sense, is that they will continue to provide support to the Ukrainians. I hope. That's my goal. Sir?
The Saakashvili satellite, do you think he's going to have further political ambitions?
This is so interesting. So Misha Saakashvili was the president of Georgia, as you can tell by his name. A big reformer in his time. And it was Saakashvili who bore the brunt of the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008 that Melissa talked about. So I mentioned how Petro Poroshenko, when he was elected a year ago, all parts of Ukraine elected Poroshenko, and I mentioned how he brought in outsiders, brought in an American to be the Minister of Finance, Natalie Jaresko. Well, he also brought in Misha Saakashvili to, at that time, head up his International Advisory Commission. But it turned out that Poroshenko had an even better idea for Saakashvili, who, as I say, was a real reformer in Georgia. And Saakashvili had this great reputation. As you say, he's kind of very popular now in Ukraine because he is a reformer and he got good results in Georgia. And he's now the governor of Odessa. So again, Poroshenko has made a foreigner, in this case Saakashvili, a Ukrainian citizen, and appointed him, which the president of Ukraine can do to governors, appointed him as the governor of Odessa, where he's doing the same thing he did in Georgia, which is reform. And he's reforming the police, and he's very popular. He takes the subway or the trolley to work. He does all of these kind of things. He mingles with the people from Odessa, and they love him. And now I've read just this last week that Saakashvili is the most popular politician in Ukraine. And the prime minister of Ukraine, a guy named Yatsenyuk, who was there when I was there, and I got to know, he's also a reformer, but he's not very popular because he has to take difficult decisions. But Saakashvili is a very interesting phenomenon, and we will see if he shows up. I want to thank you all very much. Melissa, thank you very much for inviting me. This has been a great opportunity for me to have a conversation with you. I'm so glad that you've focused the last 4 sessions of this on Ukraine. I think it is. I think it's an important part of the world. My own view is Putin is a bigger threat to international security than ISIS. I think that because he's willing to violate laws, international treaties, and he's got a good military. That's a bad combination, in my view. ISIS does horrible things, and we need to be fighting them too, but when you take a look at what could be the biggest threat to international security, I would say it's Mr. Putin. So I'm glad you're looking at this, I'm glad you're focused on this, and I'd be glad to answer any more questions by email if anybody would want to do that.
Thank you so
Melissa,
much,
thank
Mr.
you.
Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You just watched the lecture with the former United States Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor. He talked about the prospects for peace in the country. This talk was part of the 4-session course, Ukraine in the Crossfire of Conflict Between East and West, offered by Montgomery College's Lifelong Learning Institute. Check the Institute's website for courses. Thanks for watching.